Some people can run at altitudes that would leave most of us gasping for air, and it has nothing to do with how hard they trained. The Ethiopian highlands rise between 2 and 4,000 meters, thin enough to knock out anyone unprepared within days. But communities have lived up there for tens of thousands of years, and evolution quietly rewired their cardiovascular systems for it. Their bodies pull more oxygen from every breath without thickening the blood the way a typical altitude response does. Better capillary density, calmer metabolism under low oxygen, and hemoglobin that stays efficient instead of overreacting. That's a big part of why Ethiopian and Kenyan highland runners own the record books in distance running. The catch is that the same tuning can make life at sea level slightly less efficient for some of these individuals, and some of the altitude-specific gene variants don't transfer cleanly to other environments. Arctic and Inuit ancestry. Then there's the opposite extreme. Certain Inuit lineages can eat a diet that is almost entirely fat, sourced from marine mammals and fish, and come out with blood work that would make a salad eater jealous. For half the year the Arctic offers essentially no plant food, so survival meant thriving on 70 to 80% fat for thousands of generations. That pressure produced unique changes in fatty acid metabolism, especially around the FADS genes, letting these populations process massive amounts of omega-3s and saturated fat without the damage it would cause elsewhere. Their bodies default toward ketosis, and they run higher rates of brown fat and basal metabolism suited to cold. Historically, this showed up as strikingly low cardiovascular disease despite the extreme fat intake. The trade-off appeared once processed carbs and refined sugar entered the picture. The same genome that handled whale fat effortlessly struggles badly with a Western diet. Northern European ancestry. Most adult mammals, humans included, lose the ability to digest milk after childhood. Northern Europeans are one of the rare exceptions. About 10,000 years ago, as dairy farming spread through the region, a mutation that kept the lactase enzyme active into adulthood offered a massive nutritional edge, especially through lean winters. The trait spread through the population remarkably fast by evolutionary standards. Walk into a supermarket in Denmark and the dairy aisle tells the story better than any statistic. The catch isn't biological so much as cultural. Most of the world's adults, something like 65%, can't digest lactose the way Northern Europeans can, and assuming otherwise has caused real problems when dairy-heavy diets get exported elsewhere. Sub-Saharan African ancestry. One of the most studied genetic trade-offs in human biology comes out of sub-Saharan Africa, where malaria has been a dominant killer for millennia. Evolution responded with changes to the hemoglobin gene that disrupt the parasite's ability to infect red blood cells, the most famous being the sickle cell variant. Inherit one copy and you get real protection from severe malaria. Inherit two and you develop sickle cell disease, with lifelong pain crises and organ damage. The geographic spread of the trait lines up almost perfectly with historical malaria zones across Africa, the Mediterranean, and South Asia. It's a brutal bargain that made sense at the population level while being devastating for the individuals who ended up with two copies. Southeast Asian Sea nomad ancestry. Some divers in the Pacific can hold their breath for over 10 minutes, and it isn't a trained skill so much as different internal anatomy. The Bajau people of Southeast Asia have built their lives around free diving for over 1,000 years, and researchers found their spleens run about 50% larger than neighboring non-diving populations. A bigger spleen means a bigger reservoir of oxygenated blood to draw on mid-dive. Genetic studies have tied this to variants in the PDE10A gene with strong signs of selection. Bajau divers routinely work 60 meters down with minimal gear and without the decompression issues that plague recreational divers. Outside the water, though, the trait offers little benefit and may carry small risks during certain illnesses, particularly ones affecting the spleen. Pacific Islander and Polynesian ancestry. Polynesian ancestors crossed thousands of miles of open ocean with no guarantee of finding land, and the biology that got them there was built to store energy aggressively and ration it during scarcity, a strong real-world case of the thrifty genotype. That meant efficient fat retention, dense muscle mass, and bodies that could survive long voyages and unpredictable food supply. It's part of why Polynesian and Pacific Islander athletes are so overrepresented in sports built on strength and explosive power, from rugby to the NFL. The same storage-efficient biology becomes a liability the moment it meets modern processed food, which is a large part of why Pacific Islander populations carry some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity in the world. Mediterranean ancestry. Around the Mediterranean, malaria drove a different genetic solution than sickle cell. Populations from Greece, Italy, Cyprus, Sardinia, and parts of the Middle East evolved high rates of thalassemia and G6PD deficiency, both of which alter red blood cells in ways that make life harder for the malaria parasite. Carriers of a single copy get partial protection, and in places like Sardinia the trait climbed to 10 or 20% of some village populations. Today Cyprus and Sardinia run routine genetic screening because two carriers having children together carries real risk. The homozygous form causes severe anemia and historically cut life expectancy dramatically, the same evolutionary trait as sickle cell, just playing out in a different population. East Asian ancestry. Roughly 40% of East Asians turn red and feel ill after a single drink, and it isn't a random quirk. A variant in the LDH2 gene, widespread among Han Chinese, Japanese and Korean populations, blocks the breakdown of acetaldehyde, the toxic byproduct of drinking alcohol. It rose in frequency somewhere between 7 and 10,000 years ago, roughly tracking the spread of rice farming and rice fermentation. The leading theory is that it discouraged heavy drinking and may have offered some protection from pathogens common in fermenting grain. Populations carrying the variant do show lower rates of alcohol abuse, but heavy drinkers among carriers face sharply elevated esophageal cancer risk, since the acetaldehyde that doesn't get broken down is itself carcinogenic. Middle Eastern and North African ancestry. Middle Eastern and North African populations evolved in some of the harshest heat on the planet, and their bodies show it: efficient sweat function, strong kidney concentration ability, and circulatory systems that hold blood pressure steady under extreme thermal stress. There's also a higher prevalence of protective variants against arid zone pathogens. That heat tolerance shows up clearly in military, agricultural, and athletic performance in hot climates. Move that same biology into a cold, dark, low-sun environment like Northern Europe or Canada, though, and it often produces vitamin D deficiency and seasonal mood effects, a genuine mismatch between an arid-tuned body and a wet, dim climate. Central Asian ancestry. Central Asian populations evolved across an unusually wide range of conditions. Mountains, steppe, desert, brutal winters, harsh summers, and mobility was the survival strategy for millennia. Rather than optimizing for one extreme, selection built in balance. Decent cold tolerance, decent heat tolerance, moderate altitude tolerance, a sturdy frame for physical work, and a metabolism that handles feast or famine swings reasonably well. Historically, this let Central Asian populations expand into wildly different environments and do fine in most of them. The trade-off of being a generalist is that specialists usually beat them at any single extreme. They don't dominate altitude sport, cold endurance, or heat tolerance events, they're just solidly competent everywhere. Indigenous American ancestry. Indigenous populations across the Americas adapted locally to an enormous range of conditions. High altitude in the Andes, Arctic cold, tropical Amazon heat. The Andean altitude adaptation works differently than the East African one, relying on a higher red blood cell count and greater oxygen carrying capacity rather than altered hemoglobin saturation. Quechua and Aymara populations function at 4,000 meters in ways most lowland populations simply can't. Elsewhere, adaptations centered on resistance to local pathogens and diets built around foods like maize, cassava, and bison. The trade-off arrived after contact. Bodies tuned for traditional pre-colonial diets met refined sugar, alcohol, and processed grains, and the result has been some of the highest diabetes and metabolic disease rates in the world. South Asian ancestry. South Asia holds one of the longest continuous agricultural histories on the planet, with populations shaped over thousands of years by rice and grain-heavy diets under intense sun and humidity. Selection favored high melanin for UV protection, efficient sweat function for heat tolerance, and a metabolism that extracted maximum nutrition from limited calories. That heritage shows in relatively low UV-related skin cancer rates and strong historical performance in agricultural, tropical settings. The trade-off is one of the harshest mismatches in modern health. South Asian populations carry some of the highest global rates of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, often at lower body weights than other groups, because a body tuned for scarcity and physical labor now meets office work and abundant food. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Ashkenazi Jewish populations trace back to a relatively small founding group in medieval Europe, somewhere around 350 to 500 people, 6 to 8 centuries ago, followed by long periods of marrying within the community. That created a textbook founder effect, concentrating certain rare variants far beyond their frequency in larger populations, some linked to disease risk like BRCA1, BRCA2, Tay-Sachs, and Gaucher disease, alongside other neutral or even protective variants. Because those variants were so concentrated, Ashkenazi family studies played an outsized role in mapping conditions like the BRCA mutations and Tay-Sachs, benefiting medical research well beyond the community itself. The same concentration that made the science possible also means real, elevated disease risk, which is why genetic screening is now standard practice in family planning for many Ashkenazi communities. Slavic ancestry. Slavic populations evolved through some of Europe's longest, coldest winters, with short growing seasons and extreme swings between summer and winter. That pressure favored fat distribution suited to insulation, a robust frame built for sustained labor in harsh conditions, and a metabolism tuned to seasonal, grain and meat-heavy diets. It shows up today in strong historical performance in cold weather sports, heavy athletic events, and military endurance metrics in cold conditions. The same biology can struggle in tropical heat, and the traditional diet, transplanted into a modern sedentary lifestyle, has been linked to elevated cardiovascular disease and alcohol-related illness. Celtic ancestry. Celtic and North Atlantic populations evolved under some of the weakest, cloudiest sun exposure humans have ever lived with, across Ireland, Scotland, and coastal Atlantic Europe. Since every bit of available UV mattered for producing vitamin D, selection pushed skin pigmentation lighter and lighter, which is where the fair skin, red hair, and freckling common to Celtic ancestry come from. That same biology can generate vitamin D from sunlight that wouldn't register at all on darker skin. But move a person with this ancestry to Australia, the American Southwest, or anywhere with intense UV, and the same trait becomes a serious melanoma risk. Skin cancer rates among Celtic descent populations in sunny countries are among the highest anywhere. A genome built for gray skies doesn't hold up well under bright ones.